My name is Travis Greer. And the day I got the call, I felt something crack inside me. It was one of those days when the rain felt like it had a personal vendetta against me, seeping into the edges of my suit, turning the world outside my office window into a smear of gray. I was standing at the head of the conference table, pitching a design for a high-rise that would put my firm's name on the map. The kind of job that makes careers. My voice was steady, every word rehearsed. Then my phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times, an insistent vibration in my pocket that I tried to ignore. But it was my mother's name on the screen. She never called during work hours. Never. I remember the way her name looked, like it was written in a different language, a warning I couldn't translate. I felt the eyes of the clients on me, expectant, polite, but I couldn't focus. I stammered something about a family emergency, left my laptop open on the table, and ducked into the hallway. My hand trembled as I called her back. The line crackled like a dying campfire. Travis. Her voice was raw, as if scraped against something jagged. It's Blake. There's been an accident on Mount Renner. My twin brother. My reckless, fearless, bigger-than-life twin. I felt a weight settle in my chest, 1,000 pounds of disbelief. What do you mean, accident? I demanded, but she just sobbed. They said he fell. Into a ravine. Bodies, mangled. Only his watch, his ID, his pack. Her words broke apart like wet paper, and I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as if I could force her voice to make sense. My mind latched onto the word mangled and refused to let go. I tried to picture Blake, the same man who once leapt off the roof of our childhood home into a snowbank, who'd always been the one to climb higher, run faster, dare more. Mangled. My vision blurred. The hallway seemed to tilt. I don't know how long I stood there before someone, maybe a colleague, touched my arm, their voice a muffled echo. Travis, are you okay? I think I nodded. I think I said I had to go. The next thing I remember clearly is the drive home. The windshield wipers thudded in time with my pulse. Every mile blurred into the next. At home, Juliet met me at the door. My wife. Beautiful, composed Juliet. 5 years of marriage. She'd always been the picture of grace, the one who knew how to steady me when my brother's wild streak threatened to drag me under. But that night, her eyes were too calm, too dry. She took my coat, led me to the couch. Everything's been taken care of, she said. You don't need to see the body. Her voice was soft, but the firmness in her tone made my skin crawl. I wanted to ask why. Why didn't she want me to see him? But I couldn't form the words. Instead, I let her pull me close, let her whisper that it was going to be okay. But it wasn't. Not even close. Later, when the house had gone quiet, I stared at the ceiling and remembered the last time Blake had been here. He'd stayed for a week, wandering around my house like he couldn't find a place to sit still. One night, we'd stayed up late, drinking whiskey on the porch. He looked at me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. You and Juliet, he'd said, his voice hesitant. Everything okay? I'd laughed it off, told him not to worry. But his eyes had lingered on mine, full of questions I didn't want to answer. Now, lying there in the dark, I thought about Juliet's late nights, the hushed phone calls she took in the hallway, the way she'd sometimes flinch when I reached for her. Grief plays tricks on the mind, I told myself. But the cracks in the architecture of my life were too precise, too sharp, like stress fractures in a glass wall. I could feel everything I'd built beginning to shift, the foundation trembling. And in that trembling, I felt a cold certainty that I didn't want to face. Something was wrong. I rolled over and stared at Juliet's sleeping face. She looked peaceful, the moonlight casting her features in soft relief. But even in that serenity, I couldn't find comfort. I thought of Blake again, his easy smile, the way he'd always drawn people in, made them believe anything was possible. He'd lived his life like a firework, blazing bright and reckless. Now he was gone, or so they said. My eyes drifted to the empty side of the bed, the place where I'd always felt his presence, even if only in my memories. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, stared at the screen, half expecting a message from him. Some stupid joke. Some adventure he'd roped himself into. But there was nothing. Just a black screen and a reflection of my own hollow stare. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to grieve a twin brother who felt like the other half of me. I didn't know how to trust a wife whose smile no longer reached her eyes. I didn't know how to keep the walls from crumbling. But I knew one thing. Something had broken inside me the day I got that call. And I wasn't sure it could ever be put back together again. The funeral was closed casket. I stood beside it like a man underwater, every breath shallow, every second stretched and thin. The room was filled with people I barely recognized, faces from our childhood neighborhood, old schoolmates, colleagues from the firm, people who'd known us only as the Greer twins. They'd come for closure, I suppose, to say goodbye to the wilder half of me. But there was no goodbye in that room, only a vacuum that pulled at my chest until I thought I might collapse. Juliet stood next to me, her hand on my arm like an anchor, but her touch felt foreign, like a stranger's. She cried, but the tears seemed too perfect, too practiced, like she'd rehearsed the grief in front of a mirror until it fit her face just right. I kept waiting for something to feel real, a tremor in my chest, a tear that wouldn't stop, but all I felt was the cold weight of a truth I couldn't name. That night, after the last guest left, I sat alone in the darkened office, the rain outside blurring the city lights into a watercolor of gray and gold. My computer screen was still on, the blue glow making my face look hollow and tired. I couldn't sleep, so I stared at the screen, hoping for some distraction, emails from clients, invoices that needed approval, anything to keep me from thinking. But then it happened. The ping of an incoming email. Blake's name on the screen. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was a sick joke, spam, or some automatic notification. But the subject line made my heart stop, not what it seems. My hand shook as I clicked it open, half expecting nothing but a blank page. Instead, there was a single line, a password, Summit Twins 1989. My stomach twisted. Our childhood nickname. Our birth year. A code only the two of us would know. I copied the password, breath shallow, and entered it into the file he'd attached. A folder opened. Insurance. Inside, a single video file. I clicked play, the screen flickering to life. At first, the image was shaky, grainy, like an old home movie. Then it steadied. Juliet. My Juliet. Sitting on a couch I recognized from our home, her hair pulled back, her eyes shining in a way I'd only seen when she was with me. Except she wasn't alone. The camera shifted. A man entered the frame. Grant. My business partner. My best man. The one who'd toasted our marriage, who'd told me I was the brother he'd never had. He sat beside her, too close. Their hands touched, fingers interlaced. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was hungry. My breath caught in my throat. My mind felt like it was unraveling, thread by thread. The camera angle shifted again, catching the edge of a table, the glint of a bottle, my whiskey bottle. My glass. I saw Grant pour something into it, a white powder dissolving with a swirl. Juliet's voice was a low hum, too soft to catch, but I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what it meant. Betrayal. Poison. Everything. I slammed the laptop shut, the darkness of the room pressing in on me like a coffin. Then my phone buzzed again. A text message. From Blake's number. I'm not dead. That's not me in the casket. My vision blurred. My hands trembled. I read the message again, then again, like it might change. I wanted to believe it was some cruel prank, a hacker, a mistake. But I knew my brother's way of thinking. He was reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He'd always been the one who found the cracks in the system, the loopholes no one else saw. If he said he wasn't dead, I had to believe him. I couldn't breathe. The world around me shifted, the furniture warping, the walls pressing closer. Juliet's soft laughter drifted up from the kitchen. The sound of dishes, the clink of silverware. A home that felt suddenly like a trap. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, each one a question mark. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that video. Juliet's lips on Grant's. Grant's hand on my glass. The betrayal was a poison in my veins, thicker than blood. And beneath it all, a darker truth whispered, a voice that said maybe this had all been planned. That the funeral, the tears, the closed casket, it was all an elaborate stage. Juliet had always been the actress, playing her roles with a perfect smile. I remembered the way she'd insisted I didn't need to see the body. The way she'd shush my questions with a practiced grace. But now I saw it. The shape of a conspiracy. A structure built with perfect angles and lines that only an architect could appreciate. My life had been designed by someone else, every beam and pillar calculated to hold me in place while they tore it down around me. The minutes crawled by, each second a hammer against my skull. I opened the laptop again, the blue glow revealing the face I no longer trusted. Juliet's face. Grant's face. I watched the video on repeat, each viewing stripping away another layer of denial. And beneath the betrayal, I saw the fingerprints of my brother. Blake had always been the wild one, the one who tested the edges of every rule. But he was also the one who'd taught me to see the world as it was, not as it pretended to be. If he was alive, and I had to believe he was, then he'd left me this breadcrumb trail for a reason. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew one thing. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not Juliet. Not Grant. Not even the walls of my own home. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I felt the last of my old self slip away. The husband. The partner. The trusting brother. What remained was something harder, sharper. A man who'd been broken and rebuilt himself from the shards. I watched the sun rise through the window, the rain finally stopping, the world wet and clean, as if daring me to start fresh. But I wasn't sure there was any clean slate left. Only the ghost of the man I'd been, and the echo of my brother's message. I'm not dead. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle like dust. Nothing was what it seemed. Not anymore. I met Blake the next morning at the one place no one would guess, Betrayal Cafe, the same spot where we'd built cities out of wooden stirs as kids while Mom drank bitter coffee and pretended we were angels. The place hadn't changed much. Same cracked linoleum, same clatter of plates, same whiff of burnt toast that always lingered near the counter. I walked in with my head down, my hood up, and every nerve on edge, half expecting this to be a trap. But there he was in the far corner, hunched over a chipped mug, the same restless energy vibrating off him that I'd always known. Only now, his beard was thick and wild, a scar slashed across his cheek like a warning sign. His eyes still mirrored mine, though same blue, same intensity. I hesitated at the table, half expecting him to vanish. But he didn't. He looked up and grinned that lopsided grin that always meant trouble. "Hey, brother," he said, voice low. "Long time." I sat down, my hands clenched so tight I thought my knuckles might crack. "You're supposed to be dead," I managed to choke out, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. He sipped his coffee like it was a lifeline. "That was the plan," he said. "Their plan. And mine." His eyes darted around the cafe, scanning for anyone listening. But we were alone, just two brothers, one resurrected. I leaned in. "What the hell happened?" I demanded. "Juliet. Grant. Mom. They said you fell. They said there was no question." His eyes softened, just a fraction, like he hated what he had to say. "They wanted me dead, Trav. And you next. They wanted the family estate, the trust, your firm, the insurance payout. Everything. I was in their way." I shook my head. "Our parents." The question came out strangled. He nodded, grim. "Marlon and Greta. Even Uncle Silas. They set me up. Drugged a homeless veteran who looked enough like me after a fall. Pushed him into that ravine. Dressed him in my gear. My watch, my ID, everything." My stomach lurched. I thought of that watch. Our birthday gift when we turned 21. Titanium, engraved with Summit Twins 1989. I'd held it in my hands at the funeral home, clutched it like a talisman. But the funeral, the casket, I couldn't finish. He sighed. "Closed casket, Trav," Juliet insisted. "Said it would be easier on you. Said you shouldn't have to see me like that." His voice dripped with bitterness. She sold it so well. The grieving widow. The perfect actress. My head spun. "Juliet. She's in on it? With Grant." He leaned back and folded his arms. "They're lovers. Have been for over a year. I overheard them at the cabin, talking about the insurance, the firm, everything. Uncle Silas was there too, talking about the trust and how they'd split it once you were gone. It was all laid out like blueprints." My blood ran cold. I thought of the whiskey glass, the video, the way Juliet had started locking doors when she made phone calls. I thought of the night I'd caught her leaving the house at midnight, saying she needed air, and the way she'd told me, so gently that I didn't need to see the body. "Jesus," I whispered. "They're planning to kill me too." Blake's eyes hardened. "Tonight, Trav. She's been drugging your whiskey every night, building your tolerance. Tonight's the final dose. They're staging a suicide. A note she's already written in your handwriting. A perfect crime." I felt the world tilt beneath me, like the floor had given way. Every detail of my life, my marriage, my family, my business, now felt like scaffolding built to hold me in place while they burned it all down. But then Blake's hand clamped on my arm. "They underestimated one thing," he said, his voice fierce. "You're an architect. You never build anything without an exit plan." I stared at him, the truth igniting inside me like a fuse. He was right. I'd spent my whole life designing structures that could withstand anything: earthquakes, floods, the worst that nature could throw. I'd always left a way out, a hidden exit. And now, I realized, I'd done the same with my life. I'd installed a crawl space during the last remodel, a narrow passage that led from the basement to the old wine cellar, accessible only by removing 2 floorboards I'd hidden beneath a stack of blueprints. No one but me and Blake knew it was there. I met his eyes, that mirror of my own. "They're not going to get away with this," I said. He nodded. "Good. Because they think they've got you. They think you're weak. They don't know you've got a ghost on your side." My mind raced. Every conversation I'd had with Juliet, every look from Grant, every phone call from Silas, it all snapped into focus like lines on a blueprint. A structure built to collapse on top of me. But they'd forgotten the architect. The man who knew every beam, every flaw, every exit. I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt since the funeral control. "What do we do?" I asked him, my voice low and urgent. He leaned closer, his eyes alight with that reckless fire that had always gotten him into trouble. "We let them think they've won," he said. "You drink the whiskey. You take the dose. You let them set the stage. Then you disappear." I nodded, the plan already forming in my head. A suicide note I'd rewrite in their words. A glass I'd mark for evidence. A crawl space I'd vanish through. And then I'd be the ghost. The man who shouldn't exist. The shadow they couldn't kill. I felt my pulse steady, my mind clearing like glass wiped clean. "They thought they were dealing with a victim," I said. "They were wrong." Blake's grin returned, fierce and proud. "That's my brother," he said. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. The fight had begun. And this time, the architect held the plans. That night, the house felt like a mausoleum, a silent, oppressive shell around me. Juliet moved through it like an actress waiting for her cue, her movements graceful and rehearsed, her smile brittle as glass. I watched her from the hallway as she poured the whiskey, my whiskey, into the heavy glass tumbler. She added a single ice cube, swirling it with deliberate precision. I couldn't help but think about the powder, the way Grant had mixed it in the video Blake showed me. My stomach churned. She turned, saw me watching, and smiled with a practiced softness. "Long day?" she asked. I nodded, the lie catching in my throat. "Yeah," I croaked. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. She handed me the glass, her fingers brushing mine. A touch that once felt like home now felt like a blade. I took it, staring at the amber liquid, the ice cracking faintly as it shifted. I forced my lips into a smile. "Thanks, Jules," I said, my voice steady. She kissed my cheek, a cold, fleeting press that made my skin crawl. "I'll just finish up some emails," she said. "You go relax." I watched her walk away, her silhouette vanishing into the glow of the kitchen light. I carried the glass to my office and set it on the mahogany desk. The room smelled of old paper and cedar oil, the scent comforting in its familiarity. I sat down, my mind a storm of calculations. The crawl space was ready, hidden beneath the floorboards I'd designed to blend seamlessly with the rest of the room. Only Blake, and I knew it existed. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was just another blueprint, another project that needed precision to succeed. I picked up the glass and lifted it to my lips, letting the whiskey touch my tongue before I set it down. I reached for the tiny recorder Blake had slipped me at the cafe, its matte black casing blending into the shadows. I clicked it on, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. I let it roll, capturing the silence, the creak of the house settling, the distant sound of Juliet humming in the kitchen. I picked up the whiskey again and poured it into the potted plant near the window, watching it soak into the dry soil. Then I wiped the rim of the glass clean with the handkerchief I'd kept in my pocket, careful to preserve her fingerprints. I slipped the handkerchief into a sealed plastic bag, my hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Then I picked up the real letter. The one Juliet and Grant had so thoughtfully drafted for me in my own handwriting. "I'm sorry," it began. I couldn't handle the pressure. I couldn't live with the failures. I read it once, twice, every word a betrayal. I folded it neatly, slid it into the envelope, and placed it on the desk where they'd find it. The stage was set. All that remained was for me to disappear. I moved to the bookshelf, pulling the third volume from the left, Modern Architectural Design. The hidden latch clicked, and the floorboard creaked open. The crawl space yawned beneath me, a dark tunnel of safety. I took one last look at the office, the place where I'd sketched dreams that would never come true. Then I slipped inside, closing the hatch behind me. The darkness pressed close, but it was familiar darkness, one I'd prepared for. My breath echoed in the narrow space as I crawled forward, every inch of the path memorized. The tunnel led to the wine cellar, a relic from the house's past I'd never bothered to renovate. I reached the end and pushed open the concealed door. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood. I slipped through and paused, listening. Upstairs, footsteps, 2 sets. Juliet and Grant. Their voices carried through the floorboards, low and conspiratorial. "It should be over soon," Juliet said. "The note's in place. Silas will handle the trust transfer." Grant's voice was a murmur of agreement. "The firm's board will back me as the interim." Travis was too unstable to keep the helm. My teeth ground together. The confidence in his voice made my blood boil. I reached into my pocket and gripped the recorder, its red light still blinking. Evidence. Proof. Their words, clear as a confession. I pressed it tighter, imagining the look on their faces when the truth surfaced. I stayed hidden until I heard them leave, footsteps retreating, laughter fading. I waited longer still, counting to 100, then 200. When I emerged, the house was silent again. I moved to the office and carefully replaced the whiskey glass on the desk, fingerprints intact. I laid the fake suicide note beside it, arranged just so, the perfect tragic tableau. I took one last look at the room, the dark wood, the heavy drapes, the architectural drawings on the walls. My life's work, my home, and now my trap. I slipped back into the crawl space and made my way to the old service exit at the rear of the property, a relic from the days when the house had staff. It hadn't been used in years, but I kept it functional, a detail no one else knew about. I stepped into the night air, the chill biting my skin. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, glistening in the moonlight. I moved quickly, a shadow among shadows, every step measured, every breath controlled. By the time the sun rose, Travis Greer was officially dead, a suicide in his own home, a man who'd cracked under the weight of his own failures. But a new man had been born in the darkness, a man with no ties, no name, no limits, a man who held the plans in his hands and was ready to bring the entire structure down on those who'd built it. I stood in the alley behind the house and watched the first police car arrive, lights flashing, voices urgent. I could almost hear Juliet's practiced sobs, Grant's faint shock, Silas's cold calculations. Let them think they'd won. Let them play their parts. Because this was my stage now. And every detail had been designed by the only architect who mattered, me. From the shadows, I locked everything down, every file, every account, every piece of the life they thought they'd inherited. My will had been revised months before Blake's supposed death, but they didn't know that. They didn't know that while they were busy planning my funeral, I'd been planning the collapse of everything they'd built around me. Every cent, every share, every legal document, routed through lawyers who owed me favors, accountants who owed me their jobs. My trust had been revised, buried under so many layers of conditions that no one could touch a dollar of it without a signature that would never come. My firm? Frozen. The insurance money? Rerouted to a non-profit for veterans, a cause Blake had always wanted to support. Let them explain that to the board. Let them squirm in their leather chairs as they realized the empire they'd hoped to claim had become a fortress they couldn't breach. I didn't just disappear. I orchestrated a demolition, carefully and methodically. I turned them against each other, brick by brick, like pulling the keystone from a cathedral and watching the stained glass shatter. I started with Juliet. She'd always been suspicious, always quick to doubt, to demand, to control. It wasn't hard to make her doubt Grant. I sent her emails from an anonymous account, screenshots of Grant's text messages, altered photos of him meeting with another woman at a hotel bar, a model, a brunette he'd hired for the evening. Juliet's fury was easy to ignite. I'd seen that side of her before, the jealousy that bubbled just beneath the surface. All it took was a spark. The next day, Juliet confronted Grant in the office, her voice shrill enough to carry through the walls. I listened from the loft I'd rented 2 blocks away, watching through the scope of a small camera I'd hidden in a planter near the front door. She screamed. He denied. She slapped him. He shouted back. I watched them fall apart, piece by piece, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. Then I turned to Grant. He'd always thought of himself as the smooth talker, the negotiator, the man who could charm his way through any deal. But even a charmer has cracks. I found them in his emails to Silas, emails where he questioned Juliet's loyalty, where he hinted that she might take more than her fair share. I made sure he saw the same evidence I'd sent Juliet, just altered, just enough to make him believe that she was setting him up. I added a few lines about Silas, how he'd been quietly meeting with the board to discuss removing Grant from his position once the dust settled. Grant's ego couldn't stand that. Within days, he was calling Silas at all hours, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits, unraveling like a cheap sweater in the rain. Silas was the hardest to crack. He'd always been the family's rock, solid, impenetrable, the man with the plan. But even rocks erode under pressure. I sent him forged documents, bank statements, legal letters, fake minutes from board meetings, showing that my parents had arranged to cut him out of the estate, that the deal he'd made with them was a lie, that they'd planned to blame him for the firm's collapse, to make him the scapegoat once everything fell apart. He tried to call my mother, but I'd rerouted her number through a burner, programmed to pick up with a cold, dismissive voice. "It's too late, Silas. You brought this on yourself." I imagined his face as he listened, the realization cracking the granite. It was poetic, really. The architect in me appreciated the symmetry. The man who'd held the family's financial secrets now found himself alone in a vault of his own making. Within a week, the foundation I'd spent my life building had become a labyrinth of suspicion and betrayal. I watched from my rented loft, a silent witness to the chaos I'd created. It felt like standing at the top of a building I designed, watching it implode in slow motion, every steel beam and concrete pillar folding under the weight of their own greed. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd buried me and claimed my life. But they'd only buried themselves. I saw Juliet's face in the morning papers, her eyes red, her hair tangled, her composure gone. Grant's name splashed across blogs and financial rags, embezzlement allegations, photos of him leaving bars at dawn, his reputation shredded. Silas's heart attack was just a bonus, a small, cold satisfaction that even the strongest can break when the ground beneath them crumbles. And all the while, I sat in the shadows, drinking cheap coffee and sketching plans for my next move. I'd become a ghost in their machine, a whisper in Juliet's ear at night, a flicker in Grant's office lights, a signature Silas couldn't quite place on a bank statement. Every time they thought they had a hold on me, I slipped away. Every time they thought they'd closed the deal, I tore it open again. I knew their weaknesses because I built them. I'd been the architect of every trust, every agreement, every compromise. They'd taken for granted that I'd always be there to sign off, to fix the cracks, to hold the walls steady. But now the walls were mine to break. I thought of Blake then, how he'd always loved a good prank, a clever trick. How he told me once, during a storm on Mount Renner, that sometimes the best way to survive was to let the wind take you, to bend just enough so you didn't snap. I'd bent, all right. Bent and twisted and reshaped myself into something they couldn't predict. And now, as they screamed at each other, as they tore each other to pieces over the scraps of what they thought was my fortune, I finally felt free. Not just free of them, but free of the man I'd been. The man who'd trusted too easily, who'd believed that family meant loyalty, who'd thought love was stronger than ambition. From the loft's window, I could see the skyline of the city I'd helped build. Cranes dotted the horizon like giant sentinels, new towers rising from the dust. I wondered if any of those towers would stand the test of time. If the people in them would understand what it meant to build something that couldn't be torn down. Probably not. But I did. And that was enough. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The foundation was cracked, the walls crumbling. But I still had blueprints to follow. I still had one last masterpiece to design. And when it was finished, they'd see. They'd see the architect behind every betrayal, every collapse, every fall. And they'd know that this wasn't just revenge. It was justice, drawn in steel and stone, signed in the blood of every lie they'd ever told. And so I watched. And I waited. Because the cracks were spreading. And I was ready for the final collapse. Now it was time to haunt them. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the smirk on Juliet's face, the smooth condescension in Grant's tone, the way Silas had patted my shoulder and told me not to worry about the trust. They tried to bury me, but they'd forgotten that I'd designed the foundation. And now I would remind them of the cracks they tried to hide. I started with Juliet. She'd always been meticulous, her world a carefully curated display. So I gave her something she couldn't control. She came home one evening and found our wedding night arrangement recreated exactly. The same white candles, the same champagne on ice, the same music playing softly in the background. Only I wasn't there to toast with her. Just the memory of the vows she'd broken. I left a single rose on the bed, a blood-red bloom that looked too vivid in the shadows. No note. Just a reminder that I hadn't forgotten. That I saw everything. She screamed. I heard it from the shadows, the sound slicing through the night like glass. Grant was next. He prided himself on being unflappable, the man who never flinched, the closer who could talk anyone into anything. So I made him flinch. He walked into the boardroom one morning, phone pressed to his ear, rattling off numbers and deals as if the world was his to command. But as he entered, I let him see me, just for a second, through the glass wall of the conference room. I stood there, arms crossed, watching him with the same steady gaze I'd used during every negotiation we'd ever handled together. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor, the call cutting off mid-sentence. His face went pale, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. I vanished before the others turned to look. He tried to explain himself, mumbling about seeing a ghost, about stress, but the doubt had been planted. I saw it in his eyes. The fear, the uncertainty. He knew then that the past was never truly buried. My mother was a harder target. Greer had always been the matriarch, the woman who could reduce grown men to trembling children with a single glance. But even she had her weaknesses. One night, she opened the drawer of her nightstand and found Blake's childhood toy train, rusted, burned around the edges, a relic of a time when we'd been a family. She'd given it to him when he was 6, told him it would always bring him home. I left it just where she'd find it, a reminder that not all the family secrets could be hidden. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, staring at it, her face pale, her hands trembling. That was enough for me. Even the strongest walls crumble when the foundation is rotted. Silas was the final piece. He'd always thought himself untouchable, the man in the tower pulling the strings while the rest of us danced below. But I'd built that tower with him. I knew every secret passage, every hidden door. One night, he walked into his office and found me sitting in his chair. Not me exactly, but a shadow of me. A silhouette crafted from a prosthetic mask, a voice distorter, in the darkness that lived in the corners of every room. "You buried the wrong brother," I whispered, my voice distorted, echoing off the glass walls. His face went ashen, his lips trembling. He reached for the phone, but I was gone before he could hit the button. For days, he couldn't sleep. I knew because I watched. I saw the way he jumped at every sound, the way he muttered to himself in the empty halls, the way he clutched the bottle of pills like a lifeline. Even the man who thought he'd planned every angle couldn't hide from the ghosts I'd unleashed. Every night, I moved through the city like a shadow, always one step ahead. I changed faces, changed names, rented rooms in cheap hotels, wore clothes that no one would remember. I became the man who shouldn't exist, the brother they couldn't bury. Every time I struck, I left a piece of the past behind, a letter, a photo, a memory they thought they'd erased. It was psychological warfare, but I'd learned from the best. Juliet's own manipulations had taught me that the mind is the weakest link. If you could make someone doubt their own reality, you could break them without ever touching them. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a store window, a reflection of a man I didn't recognize. The beard was gone, the hair shorter, the eyes harder. The architect was gone too, replaced by something else. Something forged in betrayal and reborn in the ashes of every lie they told. I didn't know if I liked that man, but I knew he was necessary. I knew he was the only one who could finish what Blake had started. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. About making sure the structures they'd built on my back collapsed with them inside. About showing them that the man they'd tried to bury had become the architect of their undoing. One night, I stood on a rooftop across from Juliet's new apartment, a glass tower that screamed money and status. I watched her through the windows as she poured herself a drink, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped the glass. I wondered if she thought of me every time the wind rattled the windows, if she saw my face in every shadow. I hoped so. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't the knife in the back, it's the silence afterward. The empty spaces where trust used to live. I'd given her that silence, and I'd filled it with every echo of the man she'd tried to erase. I thought of Blake then, my reckless, brilliant twin. He'd always said the best way to beat a cheater was to play their game better than they ever could. I'd played it well. I'd made every move count. And now, as the city glowed beneath me, I felt a satisfaction I couldn't explain. The game wasn't over yet. But the pieces were moving, and they were dancing to my design. The ghosts of the living were stirring, and I was the one who'd set them free. Let them run. Let them hide. The architect was coming, and I'd built every inch of their prison. They walked into the Pacific Heights Gala like royalty, Juliet in a diamond necklace that had once belonged to my mother, grand in a tailored tux that looked like it had been sewn for betrayal. The chandeliers glistened above them, all gold and glass, a kingdom they'd built on my grave. I watched from the shadows near the back of the hall, my new face hidden beneath a mask, every breath measured. The room was a sea of laughter and clinking glasses, oblivious to the storm I'd brought. My plan had taken weeks, hacking the gala's AV system, replacing the tribute montage with something of my own design. Every guest was a witness, every pair of eyes a jury. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, silence draped the room like a velvet curtain. Then the screens lit up, one by one, showing images of Juliet and Grant, smiling in the glow of stolen moments. Their laughter echoed through the speakers, at first innocent, then twisted with malice. The video shifted, a recording I'd captured with Blake's help. Juliet's voice low, conspiratorial. Travis won't suspect a thing. He'll drink it, he always does. Grant's reply, smug and confident. And with Silas on board, the trust is ours. We'll split it clean. The images flickered, jumping from the staged suicide scene. My whiskey glass, the forged note, to their laughter as they celebrated my death. 8 minutes of truth. 8 minutes of them building the gallows they thought would hang me. The silence afterward was a vacuum that pulled every eye toward the screens, every breath tight in 1,000 chests. Juliet's scream cracked the spell. She clawed at the diamond necklace, the blood draining from her face. Grant's hands fumbled for his phone, his eyes wide, his lips shaping denials that no one believed. Silas, seated near the front, turned a ghostly white. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then the room erupted, voices, gasps, accusations. The police were there, waiting. I tipped them off minutes before the gala started. They moved like wolves in a slaughterhouse, every badge ablade. Grant was the first to break, his voice high and desperate as they cuffed him, the panic in his eyes a mirror of every lie he'd told. Juliet stumbled, her legs folding beneath her, her diamonds a mockery of the love she'd sold. Silas collapsed, the weight of his sins too heavy to bear. My mother fainted in her chair, the facade finally shattering. I slipped out before the lights came back on, the night air cold and sharp against my skin. The chaos behind me was a requiem, a final note in the symphony I'd composed. Every brick they'd laid, every lie they'd told, I dismantled it piece by piece. They thought they'd written my story, ended it with a neat little bow. But I was the architect, and I designed every exit, every collapse, every carefully calculated fracture. I walked away from the gala with nothing but a quiet satisfaction and the knowledge that I'd built something unbreakable from the ashes they'd left me. The lights of the city glowed below, a testament to every structure I'd ever made, every plan I'd ever drawn. And now, in the ruins of their betrayal, I stood free. Barcelona. The city had always seemed like an artist's dream, sunlight on stone, shadows in hidden alleys, a place where stories could begin and end at the same time. That's where Rowan Vale was born. Or rather, where Travis Greer died for good and a new man took his place. I stood in front of the mirror in a small apartment tucked into the labyrinth of the Gothic quarter, the salty tang of the Mediterranean seeping through the cracked window. The face that stared back at me wasn't Travis. The beard was gone, the hair shorter, a few strategic scars drawn in places only someone with my precision would know. The eyes were harder, but they still carried the same ghosts. I practiced my new name, my new voice, 1,000 times until the old one felt like a memory someone else had told me. Rowan Vale, architect. The name felt foreign at first, but like every blueprint, it settled into place with time. I had forged every document, birth certificate, degree, even a letter of recommendation from an old professor who owed me a favor from a debt I'd long since paid. The local notary hadn't even blinked when I'd handed over the papers. People here saw what they wanted to see, and Rowan Vale was a man with purpose and a plan. I rented a small workspace near the water, filled it with sketches of buildings I'd always wanted to design, but never had the time or freedom to build. Community centers, libraries, housing complexes that didn't trap people but set them free. It felt good to work with my hands again, to draw lines that weren't built on betrayal and deceit. Meanwhile, Blake, now Leo Vale, had found his own refuge. He'd always been the one who needed the wild, the thrill. Argentina suited him. Ecotourism, kayaking, and a small lodge tucked against the Andes. He'd send me photos now and then, smiling with tourists, his hair longer and his beard still unruly. Sometimes I envied his freedom, his ability to live so fully even after everything. But then I'd remember that freedom was earned, not given. And mine was just beginning to unfold. News of the fallout back home drifted across the Atlantic like smoke. Juliet was locked away in a prison that suited her best, a place where the mirrors showed the worst of who she was. Grant, too. The recordings had been enough to sink them both. Their charm, their manipulations, stripped bare in front of judges who had no patience for betrayal. Silas suffered a stroke a month after the gala, his empire crumbling with every new headline. My parents? They'd played their game and lost, sentenced to the same prison that had once been my home. The firm was dismantled, its assets frozen or repurposed to pay debts they'd hidden from the world. Every time I read the updates, I felt the echoes of that night at the gala, the moment when every secret unraveled and they saw the man they'd tried to erase rise from the ashes of their schemes. But while the world moved on, I hadn't. Not entirely. Some nights, I'd walk the streets of Barcelona, the rhythm of flamenco guitars and laughter a soundtrack that didn't quite match the chaos in my mind. I'd pass the cathedrals, the old Roman walls, and I'd think about how history buried itself beneath layers of stone and time. I'd think about how even the most beautiful facades could hide rot that no one saw. I wondered if that was what I'd become, a man whose soul was rotting under a beautiful new name. But then I'd remember the community center I'd designed that was breaking ground in a forgotten neighborhood near the port. I'd think about the families who would find shelter there, the kids who'd have a place to learn and play, the old men who'd sit on benches in the sun and talk about days that didn't hurt so much. And I'd remember that some structures were worth rebuilding. One morning, I stood at the construction site, a dusty lot ringed by old warehouses and graffiti-stained walls, and watched as the first beams were lifted into place. The sound of metal on metal was a music I'd always understood. I introduced myself to the workers as Rowan Vale, the architect in charge. They didn't know about Travis Greer or the night I'd disappeared. They didn't know about Juliet or Grant or the way my world had once been designed to collapse on top of me. All they knew was that I had a vision and the skill to make it real. That was enough. Later that night, I sat in my apartment and opened a file I'd kept hidden, a digital vault that held the last remnants of the life I'd left behind. Old photos. Blake and me as kids, Mom smiling like the world hadn't turned bitter yet, Dad with his hair still dark, holding us both in a bear hug that felt real back then. I let the memories wash over me, each one a blueprint of the man I'd been and the man I'd become. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in months. But I let the ache settle in my chest, the quiet grief of knowing some structures couldn't be rebuilt. But I also knew this. They tried to erase Blake and me from the world. They tried to build a new empire on the bones of the family they destroyed. But all they'd really done was erase themselves. Every lie they told, every secret they whispered, it was all gone now, buried under the weight of their own greed. I'd watched them tear each other apart, each one clawing for a piece of a legacy they didn't deserve. And in the end, they were the ones who'd vanished, leaving only shadows in a world that didn't even remember their names. I shut the file and leaned back in my chair, the hum of the city drifting through the window. Somewhere out there, Blake was living his own truth, and I was living mine. Two men who shouldn't have survived, building new structures on the ruins of the past. I'd stopped running. I'd stopped hiding. Rowan Vale was the architect now, and this time, the plans were mine and mine alone. I didn't just vanish from their lives, I left reminders behind. Reminders that every time they tried to forget, every time they tried to move on, I would be there, a shadow in the corner of their mind. Juliet's prison cell was just concrete and steel on the outside, but on the inside, it was made of the memories I left behind. Every month, like clockwork, the guards would rearrange her belongings, her toothbrush on the wrong side of the sink, her sheets folded in a way that only I would have known. Sometimes, I left a single white rose on her pillow, a mocking echo of our wedding day. I watched her through the cameras I'd bribed the warden to install, watched as she woke up in a cold sweat, clutching the rose like it might stab her. She'd scream sometimes, and I'd lean back in my chair, a silent witness to the walls closing in around her. Grant was no better. His guards had no idea they were playing a part in my design. I paid them off with promises and threats, made sure they dropped words into his head, phrases only Blake and I used. Remember the mountain, one would whisper. Summit Twins 1989, another would say under their breath as they handed him his meal. The panic in his eyes was a masterpiece. He started writing letters to the warden, to the judge, to anyone who would listen. He's still here, he'd scrawl, his handwriting shaking. He's alive. But no one believed him. That was the beauty of it. I'd turned his mind into a maze with no exit. Every step he took, every shadow he saw, led him back to me. Silas was a different challenge. After the stroke, his world had shrunk to a hospital bed and a nurse who wiped the drool from his chin. But even in that fragile state, I made sure he saw me. Every few weeks, a letter arrived at his bedside, plain white envelope, no return address. Inside, just 2 words, "Remember Blake." The nurse would read it to him, her voice gentle, unaware of the firestorm she was lighting inside his skull. His eyes would dart around the room, searching for ghosts. And in that moment, I'd won. Because even though he couldn't speak, couldn't even lift his head, he knew. He knew the architect was still out there, the one they thought they'd killed, the one they'd tried to bury. And he knew that no matter how many pills they gave him, no matter how many therapists they hired, he'd never escape the foundation I'd built beneath his feet. Sometimes I wondered if that made me cruel. If I'd become the monster they'd always accused me of being. But then I'd think about that night. The night Juliet had poured my drink, her hand steady, her smile serene. I'd think about the way Grant had practiced my signature on that suicide note, the way Silas had counted every dollar in the trust, never caring who he buried to get it. I'd think about my mother's cold eyes, the way she'd said, "It's for the best, Travis. You were never strong enough to lead." And I'd feel the anger rise up in me, sharp and clear. They built this game. I just learned to play it better than they ever imagined. I moved through cities like a ghost, always one step ahead. I changed hotels every week, changed names every month. Sometimes I was Rowan Vale, architect. Sometimes I was a consultant named David Hartley or a contractor named Mark Daniels. The names didn't matter. What mattered was that I could walk through the world without them seeing me, while they still saw me in every shadow. My network grew, a web of informants and allies who owed me favors. Every time Juliet tried to reach out to a lawyer, I knew. Every time Grant's parents visited him in that sterile visiting room, I saw. Every time Silas's nurse called his children to update them on his condition, I heard the worry in their voices. And I knew they would never trust each other again. That was my design. Because trust had been the first thing they'd stolen from me. And I'd learned that once you cracked it, you could never rebuild it the same way. There were moments, late at night, in some hotel room in a city I'd never planned to visit, when I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if I'd gone too far. If the man I'd become was someone my brother would still recognize. Blake had always been the wilder one, the risk-taker, the one who'd jump first and figure out the landing later. But he'd had a heart that trusted too easily, loved too fiercely. He'd believed in me, even when no one else did. And I'd let him down so many times. I'd been the steady one, the planner, the fixer. I was supposed to keep us safe, and I'd failed. Now I was the architect of their prison, and sometimes I wondered if that made me just like them. But then I'd remember the look on Juliet's face when the screens lit up at the gala. The way Grant's voice cracked when the police took him away. The way Silas's hand had trembled as he reached for that glass of water he could no longer hold. And I'd know that I wasn't them. Because I hadn't started this. I'd only finished it. One night, I stood outside the walls of Juliet's prison, the moon casting long shadows on the ground. I could see the faint glow of the security lights, the silhouettes of the guards as they made their rounds. I knew the schedule by heart, every shift change, every camera angle. I wasn't there to break her out or to confront her. I was there to remind myself that I'd won. That no matter how many lawyers she hired, no matter how many tears she shed, she'd never escape the structure I'd built around her. I left a small bouquet of white roses at the gate, each one carefully arranged, a silent message that I was still here, that she would always be mine to haunt. As I walked away, I thought about the future, about what kind of man I wanted to be now that the game was over. I'd spent so long fighting them, proving to myself that I was stronger than they'd ever believed. But now that they were gone, prisoners of their own making, I wasn't sure what came next. I'd built my life on revenge, on making sure they never forgot the man they'd tried to erase. But the foundation I'd laid was built on ashes. And even an architect knows you can't build a home on ruins. Maybe one day I'd find a place to rest. A place where I didn't need to look over my shoulder. Where I could trust the people around me. Where I could build something that didn't come with secrets and betrayals. Maybe I'd find that. Or maybe I'd wander forever. The ghost they'd made me. The man who shouldn't exist. But for now, I knew this. They still saw me. In every shadow, in every whisper, in every nightmare that jolted them awake in the dark. And that was enough. Because the structure I'd built around them was stronger than any prison. And it would hold them long after I was gone. As I reached the edge of the property, the night felt colder, the wind carrying the scent of salt and stone. I paused, glancing back one last time. Juliet's world was a cage now. Grant's world was a lie. Silas's world was a hospital bed he'd never leave. And my world? It was freedom. Freedom built on a foundation they could never touch. I walked away with a calm certainty. Because no matter how far I went, no matter how many names I wore, they would always see me. And they would never be free. That was the architecture of justice. That was the design they'd given me. And I'd built it perfectly. 5 years later, I stood at the ribbon cutting for a community center that bore no resemblance to the corporate towers or luxury condos I once designed. It was a modest building, all clean lines and open spaces, with windows that welcomed sunlight and rooms that felt like they'd grown from the soil itself. I'd overseen every detail, from the foundations poured under a bright April sky to the last coat of paint that smelled faintly of hope. The local press had gathered, cameras flashing as the mayor gave his speech. They called me by my new name, Rowan Vale, the architect who dedicated his life to rebuilding what others had broken. I smiled and shook hands and let them see a man who had survived, who had moved on. But beneath the polished exterior, I felt every scar, every crack, every piece of the blueprint that had brought me here. The center was built on the ruins of something else, an abandoned factory that had once poisoned the air and left the soil blackened. It was fitting, I thought, because I'd built my life the same way, on the ashes of a past they tried to erase. The gala had broken them, Juliet's face pale under the prison lights, Grant's screams echoing in the courthouse, Silas's silent tears in that hospital bed. My parents had been led away in chains, their empire reduced to a cautionary tale. And me? I'd been the ghost in their stories, the man they'd never quite caught. Every time a guard whispered Summit Twins 1989 in the halls of Juliet's prison, every time Grant flinched at the sound of my name, I'd been there, watching, reminding them, because they thought they'd taken everything from me, but they'd given me something far more valuable, the blueprint for their own destruction. I watched the crowd that day, the families who would find safety here, the kids who would build dreams in the classrooms I'd designed. I felt something shift inside me, like a door I'd kept locked for too long finally creaking open. I wasn't just the man they'd tried to bury. I was the man who'd survived, who'd built something they couldn't touch. The structure was mine now, every beam and bolt a testament to resilience. The cameras flashed, the applause rose, and for a moment, I let myself believe in the man they saw. Rowan Vale, the architect of hope. But the shadows never truly leave. Even as the mayor's voice faded and the scissors sliced through the red ribbon, I felt the weight of the past like a blueprint under my skin. After the ceremony, I slipped away from the crowd, found a quiet bench near the entrance. The sun warmed my face, but the breeze carried the memory of cold nights spent hiding, running, rebuilding. I pulled a worn leather notebook from my pocket, a relic from the days when plans were scribbled in margins and dreams were fragile things. I flipped through sketches of future projects, community gardens, low-income housing, the kind of work I'd once dismissed as too small to matter. But I learned that the smallest foundations could hold the greatest strength. My phone buzzed, a message from Blake, or rather Leo now, sent from a hostel in Patagonia. A photo of him, sunburned and smiling, surrounded by tourists in a mountain sky that looked like freedom. I smiled, my heart warming at the sight. He'd found his place in the world, and I'd found mine. But there was one last thing to do. One last act to complete the structure I'd been building all these years. I walked to my office, a modest space filled with blueprints and models, a place that smelled of sawdust and coffee. I opened the safe and pulled out the last file marked Greer. Inside were the recordings I'd saved, the evidence I'd used to bring them down. Juliet's voice, Grant's laughter, Silas's plans, all carefully cataloged. I'd kept them as insurance, a safety net in case the world tried to erase me again. But I didn't need them anymore. The structure was complete. The firm was gone, the estate dissolved, the trust scattered like dust. And the world had moved on, leaving their names to fade in the shadows. I pulled the files from the safe, one by one, and fed them into the shredder. The whir of the blades felt final, like a wall being sealed forever. I shut off the surveillance system I'd kept running in Juliet's prison, the audio feed that had whispered her nightmares into my ears every night. I deactivated the guards' codes, the ones I'd used to torment Grant and Silas. I closed the burner accounts I'd used to reroute their money, the ones that had kept them trapped in their own spiderwebs. I closed every file, every feed, every plan. Not from forgiveness. That would never come. But because the structure was complete, they had nothing left to take from me. Nothing left to use. Nothing left to build. I'd won. And now it was time to leave them to the ruins they'd created. I walked to the window and looked out at the community center, at the families gathering in the courtyard, at the kids chasing a soccer ball across the new grass. I thought of the night Juliet had poured me that drink, of the way Gran had smiled as he planned my funeral. I thought of Blake's voice on that recording, "I'm not dead," and the way he'd saved me from the fate they'd written. I thought of every blueprint I'd ever drawn, every structure I'd ever built, and I knew that I'd designed this ending as carefully as any building. Because an architect doesn't just build structures, he builds legacies. And this was mine. A structure built on ashes, but unbreakable all the same. I turned from the window, my reflection catching for a moment in the glass. Rowan Vale stared back at me, a man forged in fire and betrayal, but tempered by resilience. A man who'd learned that sometimes the strongest walls are the ones you build around yourself, not to keep others out, but to keep yourself standing. I picked up my notebook, the last page still blank. A new design, maybe. A new plan. Because the architect never stops building. Even in the ruins, there's always something new to create. I left the office, locking the door behind me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. I walked away without looking back, because the past was behind me now. The structure was complete, and I was free.